All right, so we've been talking about microevolution, which you guys should know is evolution on what kind of level? Microevolution. Evolution on the gene or genetic level. Okay, we've gone through ways that microevolution can occur. Natural selection is one of the ways, gene flow, when we get species moving from one population to another, genetic drift, which means the founder effect, when we get a new population sprouting up somewhere, mutations, sexual selection, all these things can change the gene or allele frequencies in a population. So if these things happen over time and we get a lot of these changes happening, ultimately at some point we can get a new species. So this idea is called speciation. So that's the title for our notes today, is speciation. If you want to just continue on with your notes where you left off last time, that's fine. But if you make a new title every time we take notes, you can title it speciation. Typically, I have my students just continue where they left off in every for each section in a unit, just because I like them to have all their notes together. But if you want to start a new page, that's totally fine. So today we're talking about speciation, or how species form. So in order to do that, first we have to talk about what a species is. So what is a species? A species is a group of individuals that are closely related and can interbreed. Now, what does it mean to interbreed? What does that word mean, interbreed? Interbreed means they can mate with each other, okay? So the picture I have right here is of a mule. Now, a mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey, okay? So it's when a horse and a donkey mate, they produce a mule. Now, is a mule considered a species? A mule can actually, it can't breed with anyone else. Well, it can breed, but it can't produce offspring or children with anyone else. So if a mule tries to mate with a horse, it won't produce children. If it tries to mate with a donkey, it won't produce children. If it tries to mate with another mule, it won't produce children. We call this sterile. So this mule here is sterile. It can't produce any offspring, so it can't pass on its genes. So is it a species then? You know, we don't really have a clear-cut answer, okay? Another example, a golden retriever dog and a poodle can breed and they make a golden doodle. Is a golden doodle a species? They can reproduce, but is it a species or is it a subspecies? So these definitions get kind of messy when we talk about what a species is, because sometimes there's not exactly clear-cut definitions. But generally, we say they're closely related and they can interbreed. Now, how do new species evolve? There are lots of different ways. We're going to talk about two of them. The first way is called geographic isolation. What does the word geographic mean? Geographic means like location or place, right? So this happens when two populations, or when one population gets separated in two different places. So physical separation of members of a population. You don't need to write this second sentence if you don't want to. If you want to write it, go for it. If you don't want to write it, that's totally fine. I told my kids they had the option to write it or not. Just make sure you have this definition up here, physical separation of members of a population. So how might this happen? Well, in this picture down here, we have a group of brown beetles, okay? And over time, there's a river that divides this population of brown beetles in two. Now we know rivers don't just automatically pop up, right? It takes a while for them to form. So we're not talking that these species develop in a year, right? We're talking hundreds of thousands of years. So these beetles are separated, and maybe one side of this river is a little more green than the other side. All right, and so over time, they adapt to their different environments, and these differences accumulate, and they become two separate species. So the green species and the brown species, okay? So what other physical things could separate a population? A mountain range, a road, a big crack in the middle of the earth from an earthquake, right? So all these things could physically separate members of a population. Now, you might not think like a road would actually separate them, like, oh, Miss Frankston, they can just cross the road. Well, they can, but if you're a beetle, right, that road's pretty far distance to cross. And even if you're like a deer or something, chances are, if that's a busy road, you're probably going to get hit. So we're not going to get any mixing or gene flow between these two populations, so they're going to remain different. All right, I'm going to skip ahead here. So the second way that new species evolve is called reproductive isolation. Okay, this is when individuals living in the same area are unable to mate. Why might they be unable to mate? Maybe they mate at different times. Maybe they have different mating dances or mating calls. Okay, so reproductive isolation is when they're living in the same area but they're unable to mate. Okay. So let's say, for example, one population of frogs, right? Some of them mate in early May and some of them mate in late May, okay? So because they mate at slightly different times, maybe over time, they kind of evolve into two different populations and then two different species from there. Again, we're talking over hundreds of thousands of years. This doesn't happen instantly, okay? So when we talk about making new species here, we're talking over a long period of time. Now there's a couple different ways that these new species can be made, and I know you guys have talked about this a little bit already. So we have an idea called gradualism. This is an idea that these changes in a species happen gradually over time at a predictable rate. So if we're talking about butterflies, maybe a butterfly gets gradually darker each year, right? And eventually it gets to be so different that it becomes a different species, right? Because it's such a different color and it has different mannerisms. So that's the idea called gradualism. So we are going to write that down. I'm going to cover up this other one so you guys don't have to worry about writing it yet. So gradualism is the idea that speciation occurs at a regular and gradual rate. It doesn't happen just like all of a sudden at the snap of fingers. It just happens gradually. So if we look at these butterflies over here, we can see they're gradually changing. So we have this one down here. This is the common ancestor. And they're gradually getting, this guy's getting a little darker. They have a little bit different patterns going on, but they're gradually getting darker over here. And they're gradually changing over here. So notice at each interval, it's changing a little bit, okay? Now the other idea is over here, where we have our common ancestor, and one species just changes automatically, right? It has a lot of changes that happen right then and there, and then it doesn't really change, okay? And then this one, it doesn't really change for a while, but then all of a sudden it changes, right? So the difference here is how our changes accumulate. In the first idea here, we say the changes happen gradually. Here we say the changes happen in bursts. Whoops, sorry about that. So this idea is that punctuated equilibrium. The idea that speciation happens in bursts. Okay, so punctuated equilibrium.